And now I'm proud to present this year's keynote speaker, Jonathan P. Gertler, Managing Partner and CEO of Back Bay Life Science Advisors, who came here all the way from Boston. So welcome to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here, and I can't tell you how frightened I am that I don't know which is the right button to move on the clicker, but I'm going to hopefully figure that out before today goes by. But this is my 5th trip to the Nordics in 11 weeks, which is a little above average for me, but I will say that this is a home away from home for me. I know many of you in the audience, and I can't tell you how nice it is always both to hear the excellence of the presentations and the wonderful science and technology that emanates from here, but also to be among so many friends and colleagues. The title of this is that we're sailing in choppy waters. The truth is you should sail regardless of what the waters look like, and I think the principles of sailing are similar. And what I wanted to do today was less about data, although I'll share some data about the wonderful ecosystems here and the current circumstances for financing and deal making in the life sciences. But I actually wanted to primarily spend a half an hour on a bit of the personal journey as well, because I think you know, the issues around how all of us respond to the environment in which we exist those are critical issues. And I will say that I wear many hats. I'm the CEO of Back Bay Life Science Advisors, which is an integrated strategy consulting and investment banking group that's based in Boston, but global in scope. We service global companies down to early stage. We do have a strong Nordic and European presence and very, very much enjoy working here. As long as this doesn't go viral, I'll state in this room that I would much rather fly to the Nordics than fly to California. I like it better, and the flight distance is just about the same. But one of my pet peeves in life, I have to say, is manners. And, you know, in addition to my Back Bay hat, I'm also a partner in a growth capital fund for medtech and health tech. We invest in commercial stage primarily, late stage medtech, health tech. We're just raising this fund. It should close in Q1. And I've started 3 companies, one medtech, which has exited successfully, a biotech, which is very early stage, that was based off of my research back when I was an academic vascular surgeon, and now working with one of the global leaders in that field in aortic wall biology, and a commercial stage health tech as well. And so I have the experience of being an investor, of being an advisor, of being an entrepreneur, and my common unifying theme is manners. Or the lack thereof in our current society. And so much of what I'll speak about today is actually the underpinning of it is how we can all treat each other in this very, very busy ecosystem with good manners, with respect, with all the things that actually will make for a much more productive time. So as I speak about the ways in which we approach each other and the ways in which we need to think about our ecosystem, I will tell you my retirement project, should that ever happen, and I doubt it ever will, but if it should ever happen and I actually stop doing all the things I do, will be the little book of manners for how we can all work together better. How do I move this forward? There we go. I love this cartoon because it is just so cynical. It's from the New Yorker, but you'll notice the science fair and the very disgruntled young children around the corner of the guy who seemingly is dressed, forgive me, not unlike a United States-based private equity investor. I am a growth investor, so I can make fun of myself also. And there he is, how to monetize other children's science projects, and he won the first prize. And I have 3 sons, all of whom are climate and sustainability entrepreneurs. And one of the things I love about healthcare as an ecosystem, but I've told them the same as climate scientists, is that if you pursue things with the right eye on the prize, the passion, the diligence with which you pursue increasing human health, the attention to detail, and that's your approach, the financial rewards follow. And I think so often we lose sight of that in the United States and around the world. And I just thought this was a particularly funny slide, actually saying just the opposite of what I so truly believe in. I was asked by a young student yesterday how she can become a leader one day, and I just said, you know, stay focused on what you do and what you love, and when that happens, everything else follows. I'd like to talk a little bit, because I'm always amazed in speaking to non-healthcare audiences about the lack of understanding of the difference between health tech and med tech and biotech, both of which are just critically important to our advances. Biotech, and it's certainly hit waves of resistance over the last year after such a wonderful run during the pandemic. But it's really about, as we all know, increasing biologic specificity. When I was a medical student a long time ago, there were 5 orphan diseases. I think we are now up to 6,600 because of the increasing recognition of biologic specificity. And because of that, biotechnology is by necessity, as we, I think, all know, an exercise in financial risk transfer. If you cannot find someone to accept that the inflection point you've reached might be meaningful at the next stage, you can't possibly fund the companies, hugely dependent on the public markets, given the amount of capital that is required. Although I will say, in Boston, where I come from, seeing $300 million Series A venture financing, which was happening for a couple of years, was really an astonishing event after 25 years of being in this field. MedTech and health tech are system solutions, not biologic solutions, and I think we lose sight of that, and we've heard a couple of very interesting presentations today about increasing efficiency, increasing accuracy, increasing predictability, as well as cost efficiency in the system. And what's very interesting in the Nordics, I've found, and I have been working in the Nordics for about 20 years, I have so many close friends and colleagues here, and I will say it's so always a pleasure for me to come, is that MedTech and health tech have lagged very far behind in the Nordics. And I think the primary reason for that is that biotechnology, which is so much more science-derived, versus MedTech, health tech, which is dependent on system testings, and the Nordic healthcare delivery systems, which incidentally I embrace fully, are profoundly different from the global markets, especially the US and North American markets, where things are complex, multiple payers, different motivations, et cetera. So the translation becomes extremely hard. MedTech and health tech, I'm pleased to see, are making great progress in the Nordics, and I'll state as an investor that we have every intention of supporting Nordic companies because we think the opportunity is outstanding. And biotechnology has thrived because of the intersection of foundation money, government money, excellent science emanating from the universities, and managers that have come out, and executives that have come out of so many of the good companies that have grown up here. However, when you look at what's going on here, regardless of sector, it's great. And these are, I'm going to do some data slides, and then I'm going to frankly do some personal slides. But if you look at the growth since 2021, and the first M&A deal that I did here was actually Sapphire Therapeutics, I think in 2005, which was sold to Carlsson, but it was a Novo Foundation, Novo Holding, now Novo Holdings backed company. But the growth in M&A in the life sciences is really quite substantial. These are major M&A deals done over the last numbers of years. And you'll notice also, interestingly, the MedTech and health tech have increased. So there is absolutely robustness in the system accordingly. Licensing deals, of course, are the lifeblood of how you actually fund companies and ensure that there's prioritization within your portfolio, et cetera. This has also increased markedly. Again, a sign of robustness. MedTech and health tech lag behind in this, and that is less to do with the quality of companies and has much more to do with the fact that licensing and partnering in MedTech and health tech, as a rule, have not been the vehicles that have been deployed, whereas in biotech, of course, it's critically important. But again, nothing but growth in this sector. And venture funding, similar, both deal count and amount of capital invested. Interestingly, I think, we've seen a real increase in biotech VC funds in the Nordics, primarily because a lot of the government and foundational support for funds has increased. A recognition that, again, hopefully this won't go viral, the cartel of a small number of funds was really not healthy for the system. And being able to fund new funds, many of which have broken out both in Sweden and in Denmark particularly, less so I think in Norway, and less so certainly in Finland, has allowed for more venture funding to come in primarily from Nordic venture funds for biotech, and also from elsewhere in Europe, less so in the United States, and we can talk a little bit about, and we will, what it takes to attract global investment. But that's extremely positive. I will say there's not one single dedicated health tech or med tech fund, other than Vækstfonden's very Danish-focused fund in the Nordics, and I think that's truthfully a deficit that should be corrected, or at least attract capital that is dedicated to the region. Venture funding in the U.S. has grown remarkably as well. We had a slowdown during the pandemic, but or right after the pandemic with the correction in the markets. During the pandemic, it exploded because of the success, the overnight success of Moderna and the like, which took, as we all know, 25 years for the overnight success to take place. But we don't say that out loud either. One thing that has always shocked me is that the markets went down, the biotech markets went down, and venture funding cut back. And I have to say, as a contrarian, it makes no sense to me. That's exactly when you should be investing. You should be investing when things are behind the curve, not at the peak of the curve. But the problem is, of course, for all investors, having reserves in place, not knowing when markets correct, not knowing when you need to come back in, or will you be able to come back in, or should you have reserves. And then when you look at Nordic versus US, obviously the Nordic volume is much less, but the parallel is very similar, and I think that's always a positive thing. So, you know, the summary of all of this is that the Nordic private markets, the Nordic M&A and licensing and partnering markets, what you've established here is exactly what you want to see in an ecosystem, which is outstanding technology, regardless of whether it's on the biotech or health tech, med tech side, excellent management and sophisticated management, which we've all witnessed today and yesterday with the wonderful presentations, and then the ability to translate that not into local markets, but into global markets. And I put up the next two slides on public markets. I'll call out Peter and Carlsson. Good job. Nasdaq has done just a remarkable job of actually increasing the public capitalization. So I am old enough to remember the AIM as the solution for small cap companies, and Australia as the solution for small cap companies, all of which fizzled. Never created a solution, but my prediction, which is really easy to make in the setting of this data, when you look at the aggregate market capitalization just on the Oslo and Stockholm exchanges alone, is that there is a sustainable market here. It's buffeted by investors that are long investors, not day traders, retail or institutional, that the news flow is consistent, that the technologies are excellent, and that bodes extraordinarily well, I think, for the sustainability of the Nordic markets and creates an opportunity. The great deficit in the United States is that companies that are really promising, that need capital intensity and can't necessarily raise it in the venture markets, have no ability to list publicly in a way that is sustainable. And there's nothing worse. And I ran healthcare investment banking groups for about a decade after my 20 years in academic medicine. There is nothing worse than being an undercapitalized, unsupported public company. It's expensive and it's diminishing, and breaking out of that sort of small cap or micro cap purgatory is close to impossible. The Nordic exchanges offer a solution that for the Nordic environment I think is an extraordinarily good solution. And the new rule that US companies that are not ready for the main US markets can actually list over here. I think you'll see not an abundance of flow, but you'll see good flow, and I think that will do nothing more than really increase the fervor of the ecosystem and the public markets here, and I think that's a wonderful event. Interestingly also is that on this slide you just see that medtech and health tech have an increased presence here at an earlier stage than they do in the United States, where really you can only list if you're very strongly profitable, strong EBITDA generation, and really a very, very meaningful revenue ramp. So all of this is by way of saying kudos to the ecosystem, but there are also some issues that the next slides I think should address around the way we interact across the pond, because at the end of the day, and I will say this, my last grand rounds at the Mass General, where I was an associate professor as a vascular surgeon through 2001, I had all of my colleagues who were accusing me of having a terrible midlife crisis by leaving surgery to go do what I was going to do, which was to be entrepreneurial in this environment. And I put up a slide that on the left side of the slide listed NIH, American Heart Association, DARPA, which is our Department of Defense funding. And on the right side, I listed venture capital, foundational support, IPOs, et cetera. And I asked the question of my colleagues, all of whom, as I said, were just very distressed by my decision, what is the right side, what does the left side mean, the NIH, et cetera? They said, well, that's funding. And I said, what does the right side mean? And they said, that's about making money. And I said, simply and offensively, I'm sure, the NIH is not there to support your tenure. The NIH is there to actually reduce things to practice so they can help on a global health basis. And I got a number of cold stares, and everyone said I was having a midlife crisis and I'd be back in a year, and that was 23 years ago. But at the end of the day, the ability to bring medtech and health tech out earlier, especially given the system economic and quality solutions it provides, is incredibly important. And again, kudos to the ecosystem for doing that. But at the end of the day, all companies need to serve the global master, not the local master. And I think we lose sight of that on both sides of the pond. So I've been doing this a long time, and I've advised companies, I've invested in companies, I've created companies, and I'm sharing what in surgery we used to call pearls of wisdom. Often we were accused that our pearls of wisdom actually more resembled shiny gallstones. They weren't quite as good as we thought they were, but that said, these are things that I sort of live by, and these are my mantras, if you will. Control the debate is a phrase I love, and I'll put it in the context of preparation for cross-border investment and deal-making in just a moment. I was on the board of what shouldn't be, but is in the United States, a controversial political organization around reproductive rights for women. I was one of the few men on the board of that, and this was a number of years ago. And we use the expression at the board level all the time that we had lost control of the debate, because what we were doing on this board, and to avoid political controversy, I won't say much more than that, but what we were doing was strongly supporting reproductive rights, sexual health, education, et cetera. And our words were being twisted right and left in, among certain factions in the United States. You can guess what this was about, because I obviously live in a completely archaic country relative to the rest of the world these days. But we did say that we needed to control the debate. What that means for an entrepreneur, though, and I've learned this, is that the minute you go and you make a deal and I'll put this in the Nordic context. If you go from the Nordic context to the United States, unprepared on regulatory issues, unprepared on what the markets really look like, on the adoption hurdles, on the complexity of payers, on the competitive intensity, on the ability to get into the systems that you need to get into with the proper KOLs in order to get your trial to be populated, you will lose control of the debate. And any investor or any partner will, if they're interested, do their own primary diligence. And Back Bay, works across from the global companies all the way to the startups, so we know what they're thinking. But if you go in there unprepared, what is handed to you is the other side's opinion. And it's a disaster, and it's a mistake that's made over and over again. Incidentally, not just in the Nordics. I see it in US companies constantly. Part of it is a capitalization issue. If you don't have the money, you can't get that done. But I would counsel everybody, before you reach out, figure out a way, even if you don't have the full FDA discussions, even if you haven't done the full payer analysis, to go in there with a strong set of opinions and also a plan to counter what is being said to you. Because negotiations, unfortunately, and this goes back to my manners comment, they do take advantage of ignorance and blind spots. And Back Bay spends a great deal of time with companies, younger companies, anticipating what we know our larger clients are going to be asking for. The most dilutive thing in the world is undercapitalization. I have started a bunch of companies. I've put a bunch of my own money at risk. My financial advisor is completely and utterly bald from having torn out his hair sitting down with me on a yearly basis when he reviews what I've done. But that said, as I always, it's much better to own 1% of Google than 100% of a Zebret hot dog stand in New York City. As much as I love a Zebret hot dog, they're absolutely terrific. But the thing that is so unfortunate, and I'm living through this at the moment in a really tough environment, getting a commercial stage health tech company addressing an amazing unmet need with very little competition. I'm having, it's taking me a long time to get it funded, and I'm undercapitalized at the moment, and that undercapitalization is being used against me in every investor discussion I have. The Nordic capital efficiency tradition is an extraordinary one. If I wanted to admit to looking for arbitrage opportunities, one of the reasons as an investor I would love to invest in Nordic medtech and health tech is because you've been growing up in a system of undercapitalization, of drip feeding, of capital efficiency. It's terrific. The problem is that if I have a 3-year window for investment return, which is what I do in a growth capital fund, and that's what we've promised our limited partners, and you have not done the preparation in a company here to get to the United States, to get to the global market that will precipitate the exit, I'm going to spend the first 1.5 years of those 3 making those preparations. And the reason that happens is because the companies are undercapitalized to date. So I just say this to myself over and over again, and I say it to companies, that there's never a reason not to take in capital, and being afraid that you're going to lose your position or control is way less dangerous. It's more dangerous to worry about position and control than it is to worry about actually having the means, the fuel in the tank to get to where you're going. Beginning with the end in mind, an anecdote, I took an investment banking job with a very prominent Wall Street firm after 6 years with another firm when I had first left medicine. And I had a multi-year contract with them, and I quit after 3 months. And you won't be able to find out which it is because I never list it, because I was very concerned on a how do I put this delicately? I was just concerned about my standards in terms of behavioral standards, in terms of what I saw and what I wanted to do. And I had 3 months off because I had a garden leave imposed, which I was unaware of the term until it was imposed on me. So I did 2 things. I bought a new Labrador puppy. It was fabulous. It was the single most overtrained puppy in the world. You've never seen a more repressed dog. I feel guilty to this day. But I bought this beautiful little chocolate lab, and I went back to MIT, where I'd been on faculty also, and I spent 3 months meeting with my colleagues about their projects. And every single incredibly prominent MIT professor that I met with in the bioengineering department told me about the plans, told me how each of those plans could save the world, had an enormous amount of vision, no capital, refused to take in venture capital, refused to focus, refused to prove, replicate, and scale. And guess what happened to every one of those projects? Some of them got continued NIH funding, and none of them ever went anywhere. And I think this issue of having a broad-based vision is fabulous. Proving, replicating, and scaling is critical. And I see that mistake over and over again. Again, not Nordic alone, US as well. Do what you can. Match your asset to the capital available. Make sure that you do get the right amount of capital. Make sure that you know the better way to prove the point, and then move from there. I heard I've heard companies with great platforms and, targeting multiple large chronic conditions with $4 million of a seed fund in place. You can't do that. I think you all know that. But this beginning with the end in mind, knowing where you're going to, is just critically important. Knowing the other side is really important, and I think this is especially true for those that are looking for cross-border investment or cross-border deal-making. And this works in both ways. I think that US-based investors are completely intolerant of the capital environment in which many Nordic companies arise, whether it's family office, whether it's angel, whether it's foundation funding, or among the few venture capital groups relative to the United States that can be here. And for us, I think it's critically important to understand the sensitivities that go into the fervor and the passion of starting companies in those conditions. On the flip side, however, and I've been involved in deals where American VCs have been looking very hard at companies and have wanted very much to use and deploy relatively simple but still peculiarly American venture terms with regard to board control, with regard to preferences, with regard to participating preferred, which, let's face it, it claims to be equity, but it's more like a debt vehicle. And it's created absolutely allergic reactions on the boards and management teams of some of the companies here. That's nobody's fault. It's a fault of education and understanding and communication. And a theme I'll come back to over and over again is this issue of prospective discussion. So I will spend, and this is not wearing the Back Bay advisory hat, which is a consulting and investment banking model. This is wearing the investor hat. I will happily spend time with companies that I think are investable for me in the next year or 2 or 3, counseling them and working with them to try to convince them to get to the level of understanding and point where it then becomes an easy sell for me at my partner's meeting that this is the right investment. And incidentally, we have to do things unanimously in our group because we all own investments together. Taking that time, I would rather spend time over 3 years with 10 companies and settle on 3 than ignore 100 companies until the last moment when the deal is being done and then have them come in, because it builds up trust. And incidentally, if you trust me in return and my valuation for whatever reason is a little off, or I have a term that has increasing preference, but you know that we're aligned, that is a much better choice than going to somebody who gives you a slightly richer valuation, because at the end of the day, if you succeed, no one's going to notice the difference, but what will lead to success is the mutual trust at the board level, the right syndicate, et cetera. So this, I think, is critical. When I was training in surgery at the MGH, every time you get too close to the aorta, and I was a vascular surgeon, my mentors would say, don't get so close, better is the enemy of good. And I grew up thinking, my gosh, what a great surgical expression, because every surgeon claimed that it was his or hers. Of course, it's Voltaire. I only learned that years later, but this is very true, and it is really that better is the enemy of good. Sometimes we strive for things and are such perfectionists that we ruin our chances of actually having a reasonable outcome. So just a mantra I adhere to. And again, work with those you trust. Build it up, get to know them. There's always a debate or a discussion among many panels. When should you approach your partners? If Amgen seems like a good fit for you, when should you approach them? If XYZ venture fund in the United States or late stage fund seems like a good fit, when should you approach them? And ironically, and if you're trying to go public, you certainly go on pre-offering roadshows over and over again with impunity. No one ever minds doing that, but there's a seeming reluctance to reveal yourself too early to investors or to partners. I just have to state, and it's open to debate, but I don't agree with that. I think the more you get to know people in advance, the more you build up trust and conviviality, the better the outcome is. I'm involved in a very major deal at the moment, and it's actually with a Nordic-based company. I have never in my life experienced such an incredibly positive deal dynamic where I am anticipating what they need and they are anticipating what I need. It's almost too good to be true. I wonder if there's some hidden horrible thing that's about to happen, but I don't think so. I think what it is a reflection of 3 to 4 years of discussion and trust and understanding. And it makes the deal so much more pleasant. I don't know how many of you, when I'm in the middle of a deal that's not going well, I don't sleep very much. When I'm in the middle of a deal that's going really well, I don't sleep at all. I find it just beyond disruptive. And so doing it at least with people that you trust and getting to know them early, I'll say this over and over again, I think is critical. So what are the issues? This is a long slide, and I'm not going to go through this line by line, but there are a couple of things that I think are worth pointing out. Entrepreneurs, and I am one as well, are relentlessly resourceful. We're visionary. I have been accused my entire life of having a very severe psychiatric illness called manic optimistic disorder. My family gives me a horrendously hard time about believing that I can get done what I need to get done. However, the blind side of that horrible trait or good trait is that you got to know your limitations. You need to know when to hand over control. I'm dealing with a company at the moment where the CEO is outstanding in some regards, but not able to take it to the next level. And I will say, to his great credit, there's recognition there. But it's not always the case. And founderitis is a very tough disease as well. And being able to make that transition as investors, as deal makers on the other side, that's where trust and knowledge comes into play, getting to know someone, because you can help them through that transition, because that's the weak underbelly of all entrepreneurs. From an investor perspective, there are two things that I'd like to say. One is that I do think that as overwhelmed as we are by deal flow, as much capital as we need to make sure we deploy to fit our business model, bringing knowledge and experience to the forefront is critical. And admitting where you don't have that knowledge, I think, is also critical. And I will say I've been frustrated in any number of my hats by people who reject companies based on lack of knowledge of the field, but try to hide that lack of knowledge and rather say it's not the right fit or whatever. Admit what you don't know. And if it's too much work, which it can be when you're overwhelmed, to get to know a field, as promising as it might be, so be it. The other thing, and this is from both sides of the fence, every investor has a business model. We don't serve the companies we invest in. We serve the people that are investing in us. And the way we serve them is by doing the best job for the companies that we invest in and ensuring that there are returns on that investment. But at the end of the day, we all have lanes to play in as investors, and not communicating what your lane is, and for the entrepreneur, not trying to understand what that lane is a grave mistake. And I think that's the best thing that entrepreneurs and investors can do together. Entrepreneurs need to be aware of where their shortcomings are and find ways around it. And investors need to be exceedingly clear about what their playbook is and what their lane is in order to make things transparent to the companies with which they work. This is a 100% self-serving slide. Okay, I will admit that right here. But it's very hard to get American investor attention. It's easier to take a cab from Boston over to Cambridge, just to Kendall Square, where there are more opportunities than you can shake a stick at. At the end of the day, though, there are numerous great ecosystems in Boston, despite its... Boston also has a disease you guys may not be aware of, the rapidly expanding egosarcoma. It's an extremely dangerous cancer. But you don't need to just work in Boston. You can work across any number of ecosystems. And I think what you want in investors is to those who look not to location, and the pandemic has helped this, but to look to company and technology, committed to that cross-border mentoring that I think is so critical, because that ability to bring a company to where you want it to be is essential. Knowing the region, there are cultural differences among regions. There's a cultural difference between Boston and North Carolina and California. So there certainly is from here to the Nordics, or from here to Spain or Italy or France or Germany or Switzerland. But being able to work within different cultures is critical, because the minute you diminish your geographic frame of reference, you diminish your opportunity. As an aside, I was at a venture meeting in Boston a little while ago, and this has to do with what my sons tell me is the dominance of pale, stale males in certain financial sectors in the United States. And one of the funds represented, it was an African man who stood up and said, "I represent a fund that is investing in female entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color." And then he paused and said, in other words, 75% of the world's population. And I thought it was just absolutely spot on. So geographic limitation, I think, can be extraordinarily detrimental. And if you have globally ambitious ecosystems who are willing to take the step to understand how to extend beyond their own four walls, and funds that are willing to work with them, there's great opportunity on both sides. And I just embrace that fully. So here's an exploration of American culture. A show of hands. Who knows who Yogi Berra was? I see. That's about 50% more than I expected, but that was about 6 people. So I'm actually not allowed to talk sports in my family. I can talk about fly fishing and I can talk about squash. And if you get me into football, or what we would call soccer or baseball, I'm completely ignorant. But Yogi Berra was a great baseball player, a great baseball manager, and frankly, one of the biggest idiots ever to open his mouth in American society. Nothing he ever said made sense. But I was going over Yogi Berra's famous, ridiculous quotes, and I realized that they're all relevant to the life science sector. So I'm sorry, I had to have some fun here. It's deja vu all over again is a very famous Yogi Berra quote, okay? When I started in this field post-academia in 2001, I had the brilliance to enter into the financial and entrepreneurial world right after September 11th, and I would pretty much get a weekly call from reporters saying, when is the biotech bubble? Is it burst? Is it gone forever? Well, obviously not, but this is my 5th cycle, okay? It's a lousy time to raise capital. Everybody's worried about liquidity. Everybody is worried that the IPO markets won't come back. Everyone's worried that valuations will tank and no one will get funded. It's nonsense. This is deja vu all over again. This is my 5th cycle. So Yogi was spot on. No one goes there anymore. It's too crowded, okay? Think about that one. Again, Yogi at his very, very best. A lot of times, for those of you who deal, especially with private investors, you feel like you're watching a 3rd-grade soccer game. Football game, excuse me, World Cup's on. This is why I'm not allowed to talk sports. The ball goes in the corner. Every 3rd grader runs into the corner. The trend following in the investment community can be really annoying. And I jokingly say that if you go to 20 really top-tier investors with your idea and every one of them rejects it, you know you have a unicorn on your hand. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but just stick to your guns. If you believe deeply in what you have, and I'm living through this at the moment with my health tech company, then you will, in all probability, succeed. The playbook that investors have to play by, which is narrow and risk-averse by necessity, doesn't mean that your idea is a lousy one. Here's another great one from Yogi, who could not speak English, even though it was the only language he spoke. A nickel ain't worth a dime anymore. Don't be undercapitalized, is all that means. And lastly, you got to be very careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. If anyone can explain that comment to me, I'll be very grateful. I'll be outside afterwards, but essentially, begin with the end in mind. Know where you're going. So as it turns out, Yogi Berra was not only a great baseball manager, but he's now been appointed senior advisor to Back Bay Life Science Advisors and is on our board of directors. We can all work together. I'm going to wrap it up in a second here. I think investor education is critical. I think boards need to talk to each other, and boards need to be educated by their management teams if they are mostly used to local investing into international vehicles. This is a great symposium. Make them as international as you possibly can. Regulatory, policy, education. Management needs to continually be in front of their consolidators, their partners, whether it's biotech, medtech, or health tech. I think governments and foundations can do better jobs in several ways, and I'll state this outright. If you try to seek capital from from sovereign wealth funds, and I'm not just talking about Nordics, I'm talking about everything, the vast majority of them say, we'll give you €1 for every euro you invest in our country, okay? I believe that's actually short-sighted from a policy perspective. You're not going to, we say in the United States, you can't legislate morality. You can't legislate investment. What you need to do is to create a frothy pond of investors who are interested and take a 10-year view, not a 1-year view. The problem is that election cycles are 2 years, earnings per share are every quarter. People don't take that view, but we need to shift to a much longer place to go. Shift away from country focus to ecosystem focus, always ensure an international flavor. And again, Peter and Carlsson, they did not pay me a cent for saying good things about the Nordic public markets. But the more you can have a robust regional market, the more you can trade up from there, the more you can do cross-border listings, the more you can set rational valuations. Supporting your local markets is exceedingly important. And my last bullet, because I just think this is the lesion in the world at the moment, is a lack of empathy. And it works both ways. If I respond to pretty much every company that emails me, and I get ridiculous numbers of emails a day as an investor, but the other side of this coin, and I've lived it, are people that are living and breathing and putting their houses or their families at risk. If it's wrong, just say, I'm sorry, this isn't a fit, best of luck. It takes less time than getting 18 more emails. The flip side, However, when my website says I am a late-stage medtech capital fund investing in commercial-stage medtech companies, and I get 10 emails that say I have a preclinical CAR-T technology that will disrupt XYZ cancer, it's also unfair. And I think what we don't recognize is that each of us has responsibilities. Each of us has stuff we have to take care of. There are only so many hours in a day. And if we all do our homework and we're respectful of each other, I think the world just ends up being a better place. And if you want me to really rant, I'll start talking about American society and the lack of empathy there, but you don't have the time for that. And I have a flight later tonight. But that said, to me, this is the most critical aspect of what we do. So with that, I just can't thank Jonas and his team enough for giving me the chance to speak to you all. And it is always an extraordinary pleasure to be here in this region. And this is my first time at BioStock, but it's a wonderful meeting. And I wish all of you just the very, very best in your success for what is obviously a great, great number of companies. So thanks.